Sorry, I went offline there for a second. I should be back on now, hopefully. Hello, hello, hello. Okie dokie. Where was I? Oh, yes. So, by the end of the 30s, he was going to have his plot summary. He had those, like, sort of essays on the cosmology. He was really into those details. And he was going to do this combined thing, it seems, where he had basically how it worked. It would be like plot summary of stuff that happened, his epic poems, which you now have the context for by reading the plot summary, the annals, which is like the timeline with the year by year, like play by play of things, and then the essays on the cosmology at the back of the book. So like it was going to be this elaborate project that would have taken him so long, and he, I mean, I don't have to say never would, he just didn't finish that. And eventually he changed his approach altogether to something he never finished, which was, yeah, I guess I'll explain that quickly. So he had this elaborate idea of having like poems for everything and annals for everything and then essays for everything. That was sort of like the vision he had of the Silmarillion eventually. That all changed after he wrote The Hobbit, and then they asked for a sequel, and he started writing The Lord of the Rings, because The Lord of the Rings is like a novel, like, or I guess like a set of novels, but it was really one really big novel that he was forced to break apart because of paper shortages after World War II. But it's sort of like in that genre of like romance, like not romance as in like relationships, but romance as in like it is a detailed story adventure of a person, and there's dialogue and inner thoughts of characters, and like it's a very different sort of mode of writing than anything he was writing before. His poems, his plot summaries, his year maps, all that kind of stuff. Lord of the Rings is much more like a conventional novel. I know that sounds weird to someone who's read The Lord of the Rings now, because it's very different from how novels are written nowadays, but it was more like what novels were at the time, with, you know, all that level of like detail and specificity, not just of the world, but of what specifically happens in what order, which is very different than in the Silmarillion that we have, which is where you get like, then there was a great debate, and then this thing was decided, versus, you know, the Council of Elrond, which is an entire chapter of a debate where everything every character says is documented, right? You get like their entire dialogue and everything. Very different like level. We'd say like it's like more zoomed in, I guess, than anything he was writing before was. So what he did after he wrote Lord of the Rings and was still writing, he wanted to go back to the Silmarillion and take those stories that he had previously written as, you know, poems and as plot summaries, and write those in the style that he did in The Lord of the Rings. But the problem was by needing to be so much more detailed, he actually got lost in the weeds, kind of, in my opinion. If you read like Morgoth's Ring or The War of the Jewels, you see like his later drafts of things, and he was like getting really bothered by his mythology, like the mythological stuff that he had set up. He's like, well, okay, this doesn't work anymore because it's not as scientifically accurate. Like, I can't map the moon phases because the moon hasn't been created yet, and that kind of thing. He was getting really bothered by how mythological his story was, and he started retconning things really extremely. Like he was changing the shape that the world was, what order the sun and moon came about in. Like, he started changing very drastic things about his mythology, and he just never finished doing that. We do have some of his stories that he started rewriting in prose. Like, you can buy and read The Children of Hurin, which is written a lot more like Lord of the Rings in that there's like, dialogue and stuff. But a lot of it is still kind of plot summary-ish because he just never finished. It's like the later parts of it, for example. So he never really finished that later idea that he had of like doing everything in the style of the Lord of the Rings. He also tried rewriting The Hobbit in the style of Lord of the Rings, and I'm going to say it's really bad. You can see drafts of that too. And he was rewriting The Hobbit in the style of the Lord of the Rings, so it wasn't like a fairy tale anymore. And it's just really boring when you write The Hobbit like that. It's almost like trying to turn The Hobbit into the Lord of the Rings is a bad idea. Warner Brothers. So he never completed that vision, but the closest I think he got was the idea that he had where he was writing poems for things, and then he was going to have like plot summaries and annals to fill in the gaps to make it make sense in context. And so recently when I was thinking, I was just remembering back to high school and I wrote this translation of the Ainulindale into Old English. I was thinking that I would want to do an epic poem version, because that's what Tolkien was trying to do with many of his stories in the 1920s and early 1930s, was write epic poems of his stories that he could share. And so I wanted to turn my prior adaptation, or I guess it wasn't really an adaptation, it was just a straight translation, but I wanted to turn it into an adaptation so it's not going to be as closely translating as my high school one was, but adapt it into an epic poem. Now, part of the reason he was writing Old English stuff into his earlier version of the Silmarillion was because of his frame story that he had. The frame story that exists in The Lord of the Rings is that Bilbo translated the Elvish histories into the common speech, Westron, and then gave his book to Frodo. Frodo continued it, wrote the Lord of the Rings part, and then Frodo gave it to Sam, and then eventually a copy was made in Gondor, and they added more detail and stuff about like Aragorn and Arwen and stuff. And then there were many copies made in Gondor later, and then eventually it's one of those that comes down to Tolkien, and Tolkien translates that into the Lord of the Rings. That's sort of the frame story conceit of the Lord of the Rings. And the idea with the Silmarillion, which isn't actually written in the Silmarillion, and Christopher Tolkien later regretted not including it, but the idea with the Silmarillion is that those are the stories that Bilbo translated. Bilbo translated the Elvish histories into what, like, that sort of plot summary genre that we have. But he was going to have it be not plot summary, but it was going to be like poems and the annals and stuff. Because that's kind of what you get in The Lord of the Rings. You get that story, but you also get annals in the back of the book. There's like a timeline of stuff in the Third Age in The Lord of the Rings, in the appendices. And that was the frame story, like, by the end of The Lord of the Rings, was that Bilbo wrote and translated he translated/adapted the Silmarillion, the Elvish history, and then wrote his story, The Hobbit, and then Frodo wrote The Lord of the Rings, and Sam edited it, and in Gondor they edited it again, and that's what we end up with a translation of. Back when Tolkien was first writing his myths, like back in that fairy tale mode, his frame story was different. He had a lot of different versions of it, but most of them involved this guy who was an Anglo-Saxon who sailed and ended up finding the elves. He sailed and kind of got lost or went on an adventure and found the elves, and the elves told him directly their stories, and he wrote them down. And because he was English, he wrote them in Old English. And so the stories that Tolkien was translating at the time in the frame story was that this guy went and met the elves, wrote their stories down in Old English, brought them back to England, and then I'm translating them from Old English. And that's why he was writing a lot of stuff in Old English at the time. And so my idea was sort of marrying those ideas of like, there's an, and that frame story kind of lasted and continued until he wrote The Lord of the Rings. Then he changed it to have it be Bilbo. But my idea was basically I wanted to write the version of the poem that Alfwine is the name of the character usually. He's Eriol in the Book of Lost Tales, the first versions. That's the name that Tolkien gives him, but he later calls him Alfwine, which means elf friend in Old English. And so I wanted to write Alfwine's version of the Ainulindale in Old English. And so what I've been doing, and I did this, I think I started this back in like October or November. My first project stream was me starting the process of adapting my translation into an epic poem. And I think I'm going to return to that and start that next week not start that because I did start it, but I'm going to, I think our next week's project stream is going to be me working on that a bit. I'm also a little conflicted about it too, because one thing I wanted to think about was whether or not I wanted to adapt the mythology a bit, because I was wondering if I should like lean in a bit to the analogies that Tolkien made in a later text where he was talking about how when humans came into contact with the elf stories, they reinterpreted them into sort of like their pagan understanding of the world. So like they sort of analogized some of the Valar in the Silmarillion, the sort of angelic beings that were created at the beginning of the story. They kind of analogized them to pagan deities. So like, for example, Manwe, who's like the chief god, is made to be analogous with Woden in Old English, and stuff like that. Like they were going to analogize different Valar into different deities. And so I was like, maybe I should do that, because like with Old English, I have a bunch of like deities that I could use to analogize with them. Although I don't necessarily agree with all of the analogies that were made with them. But the thing is, I'm not sure if I want to do that, because that very much changes the story, because the whole point is that there's one deity that's analogous to the Christian God. Because at the end of the day, Tolkien wanted the world to still be compatible with his religion. He didn't want to like commit idolatry. He got really worried about that, especially later in his life. He was like, "Have I sinned by making Middle Earth?" That was a concern he actually legitimately had, and so he kept making it more and more in line with his faith. But one thing that's interesting is when he actually translates, when he like writes stuff in Old English about the Valar, he doesn't use the Old English deities' names. He uses Old English names that he coined for them to describe what they're like. So, for example, Manwe, even though he says that they're analogous with Woden, he doesn't use Woden to describe him, which I think is good, because I personally don't think he has very much in common with Woden at all. At least there's like one aspect that he might kind of have in common with him, but other than that, not really. He used Old English names that he made. He called him Wolkenfra, which is Cloud Lord or Sky Lord, which I think is a lot more apt, because Manwe he's associated with like the wind and the clouds and stuff. The eagles are sort of his servants in the world, kind of like the Ensor Yavannas. So that's where I'm sort of like conflicted. Like, do I want to make analogies with heathen deities just so that it like fits better? I don't have to like borrow Elvish words, and I can just use native Old English ones, or like instead of translating them or calcing them and making new Old English terms. Or do I do what Tolkien did, which is he did make up his own terms and use Elvish ones in his Old English. And I think I'm leaning towards the latter, of just keeping it like he did. Even though he later said that humans started sort of like blending them with heathen deities, I think it just keeps the story more intact, and I don't have to change as much if I keep it how it is, where it's like sort of a more Christian story. of like there's a god and he has these sort of angel-like figures that he creates, and they have their own unique Old English names. I might use Tolkien's. I use some of Tolkien's in my original sort of translation. There's only really one place where I deviated, I think. It was in the name of Melkor. I think I talked about this in my project stream when I started this. Melkor, he calls him like Monfrea or Bolien in Old English. Monfrea is like Mon is like evil or like crime. Usually it's like bad thing. Bad thing lord is what he is. Which I'm not the biggest fan of that name. I think it's very whatever. And then Bolgen, he was trying to make it sound kind of like Bauglir in Sindarin, which is one of the names of Morgoth or Melkor in Sindarin. It means like, I think it's like, what does Bauglir mean? I'm forgetting. Not abomination. That's what Sauron means. Sauron means abomination. Which is why Sauron didn't call him Sauron. He didn't really like calling himself Sauron because that means abomination. He liked calling himself God and having his servants call him God. Bolgen kind of sounds like that in Old English, but I'm not the biggest fan of that name either, just because of how it sounds. He was trying to straddle the line with the name meaning something similar in Old English and sounding similar to the Elvish word. But what I ended up doing was I did a pun that I really liked. So there's a borrowing, I think it's borrowing from Latin, or it might be the other way around. It might be Germanic and the Romance is the borrowing. But there's a word that means pride. Because Melkor, the name of this being, his name means he who arises in might. And the sort of main sin is said that he had was pride. He like felt himself to be more important than the others, and what he wanted was more important than what the entire community of all of the Ainur were doing together. They were like an ensemble, and he was kind of like going off and doing his own solo that he made up. And Oriel also, so that's the word is Oriel, it means pride. Oriel also, like Oriele, is the Old English borrowing from the word for organ, or it can sometimes refer to other instruments. And it's said that his voice, or like the voices of the Ainur and those that followed Melkor as well, started using his theme. Their voices, the Ainulindale says that they're like instruments. That's sort of like the analogy that is made with them, is that their voices are kind of like instruments, musical instruments. And so I wanted to call him an organ because organs are like very, intense musically. Like they're very loud. Even the ones that would have been around during the time, they're pretty like intense instrument, and it feels fitting for Melkor, and it also means pride. So like Oriel means pride, and Oriele means organ, or that's one of the words for organ. There's also like organe and stuff. They're all loaned from Latin. But I liked that pun a lot, and I like how Oriel sounds. It doesn't sound like the Elvish at all, and I'm pretty sure Oriel, the word pride, is feminine in Old English, but gender with the Valar is kind of complicated. There's a lot that could be said about gender with the Valar, because Tolkien goes into it, and he writes something that kind of sounds like it's like all of the Valar are non-binary, but also he writes it in a way where like they have this sort of inherent inner gender that manifests itself in how they present themselves, and it's unclear what he means in that section. Like it's kind of confusing the way he wrote it, but I like to interpret it as they're all like they're not children of Iluvatar who have like gender in the same way. I think that's what he meant, was like, even if we can say they have something like a gender, it's not the same as gender for humans or elves. It's basically, I think, what his point was when he said it. I'm going to try to find the quote. I have the Silmarillion with me, next to me. I'm not going to show it or read much of it for copyright reasons, but I'm going to see if I can find the section where he talks about their gender. I can't remember if it's in the Valaquento or in the Ainulindale. I think it might be in the Ainulindale. It is in the Ainulindale because I remember translating it. Oh yes, okay, so this is what he says. He says, so when the Valar enter the world, they take shapes that are sort of emulating what the children of Iluvatar, which are elves and men, will look like. And so it says, they entered the world. Now the Valar took to themselves shape and hue, and because they were drawn into the world by love of the children of Iluvatar, for whom they hoped, they took shape after that manner which they had beheld in the vision that they have of the world, save only in majesty and splendor. Moreover, their shape comes of their knowledge of the visible world rather than of the world itself. So their shape isn't of the world. It's not physical. It's their knowledge about the world being manifested. So they're like kind of, it's like a hologram. It's like a projection of a shape based on what they know about the world. And they need it not, save only as we use raiment, and yet we may be naked and suffer no loss of our being. Therefore, the Valar may walk, if they will, unclad, and then even the Eldar cannot clearly perceive them, though they be present. But when they desire to clothe themselves, the Valar take upon themselves forms some as of male and some as of female. For that difference of temper they had even from their beginning, and it is but bodied forth in the choice of each, not made by the choice, even as with us male and female may be shown by the raiment, but is not made thereby. So he says that the genders that they manifest were there in their temperament before they manifested those genders. So like they had sort of an inherent genderiness to them when they were just sort of disembodied beings floating in the ether. And they take upon themselves those shapes, but the choice that they choose to take, like choosing to be male or female, it's just bodied forth. So it's not like they're not making a choice to be that gender. It's sort of like they are that gender and they're choosing to manifest it. Just like we might wear clothes to show what gender we are, but that is not what makes us that gender, if that makes sense. Like what you wear does not determine your gender, just like what the Valar wear as bodies does not determine theirs. They had it already, kind of. So there's like the way you can interpret that could be very kind of like based and interesting, or it could be kind of transphobic. It just depends on how you want to interpret it. I don't think Tolkien thought about it in either of those ways particularly, but it's sort of like you can kind of go either way with it. Like he's affirming that gender is not made by your clothes, but he's also saying that there's something inherent about those beings that gets manifested as what gender they present, even though they're non-physical, non-human or elf beings that didn't originally have gender. He's like they had a certain quality about them. And when he talks about them in the next chapter, he goes into like who's married to who. So I don't think he would have had whatever based take you can take away from that, but a lot of fans still choose to interpret it in a more progressive way, because it's fun. Because it does seem really clear that the Valar aren't like the elves and men, and that they can choose to present themselves in whatever shape they choose, or none. So you can imagine they could choose to, like, manifest in a gender that's different from the one that is typically given to them. And that's true of a lot of pagan deities too. Like there's a lot of sort of shape shifting and gender bending that happens a lot, and certain deities are like associated with being different genders at different times, which is pretty cool. And sometimes it's not just like they're disguised. Like some of them it's like, no, they're like their pronouns change and stuff too, which is interesting. One of my favorite examples is actually in the story where Loki and Thor go to get Thor's hammer. When Thor loses his hammer, Loki and Thor, I'm forgetting the name of the it's one of the, gosh, which one is it? I'm gonna get mad if I can't remember this. This is making me really upset. I don't want anything to do with Marvel. Please stop. Minus Marvel. Thrymskvida. Okay, I almost said Thrymskvida, but I wanted to be sure. Okay. In Thrymskvida, there we go. So in order to get Thor's hammer back, they go to where Thrymr lives, I believe. And Loki, who's known for being a shapeshifter, disguises Thor as a woman. This is a pretty well-known story. So Thor is like dressed up as Freya, basically, because that giant who has his hammer wants to marry Freya. That's sort of like the price. He's like, if you give me Freya, I'll give you my hammer. And Freya, they go to Freya and you're like, hey, can you like do us a solid and like go and at least entertain this man so that we can get the hammer back? And she's like, no, I don't like this transaction. I'm not interested. Good luck. Go get your hammer yourself. Girl boss moment from Freya there. I'm sorry, anyone who works with Freya, that was not meant to be a slight. Freya's great. Anyways, they go to her. She's not gonna help. She's like, good luck. So they disguise Thor as Freya, and Loki also goes as Thor's or Freya's handmaiden. But what's very interesting is even though Thor is dressed as a woman throughout the story and interacting with the giants as if he is a woman, the narrator of the poem continues to use masculine pronouns for Thor all the way through that story. So he's disguised as a woman, and like that it is a disguise. He's not like transforming into a woman. Loki, on the other hand, is like feminine pronouns are used for Loki throughout that story. Like Loki becomes the handmaiden, like for real. And so the story uses like the Old Norse equivalent of she, her pronouns the entire time that he is a woman in that story, or that she is a woman in that story. And it's really interesting that it's clear like Thor isn't changing gender, but Loki is in that story. It's pretty cool. But that, I think if Tolkien were writing a similar thing, he would not be saying that. I think he's saying that the Valar do have a gender and they can be disguised, but it's a disguise. At least that's how I interpret what he wrote. Okay, so I finished my border. I'm gonna like go back up so you can see it a bit better. It is kind of annoying that I can't be landscape. It's what I learned on my stream, which is annoying, but there we go. Here's my border. I'm very happy with this. I'm going to erase the pencil later, but I did want to show this. And we've got some space here, and I'm going to show you how I use that space. So let me do that. So what I've done, you might see it faintly, I've drawn lines. I've counted out the spaces and how I want to do them. And I do use, I know a lot of bullet journalers use like a grid spacing page or like a grid spacing ruler. I actually want to make a grid spacing ruler. I have a page in my book. It's like way in the beginning. It's kind of hard to read, but it has the number of spaces per like across and down, and also like sort of like how many each like interval, like if I want 4 sections or if I want this many sections, how many will it be, and like how much halfway is and stuff. And I do refer back to that sometimes, but I kind of remember these two numbers so that I can think like I'm going to subtract from that number however many my border is, and then that's how many I have here, and then I can divide that by how many I need. So there are 7 days in a week, and for the weekend I usually don't need to write as much weekly stuff, so 6 is a good number to divide, so I just do each into thirds. Now this did not end up being even, so my bottom has like one more line, but that's okay because Monday doesn't have much anyway, because in the US there is a holiday, so I don't actually have work that day. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my highlighter and I'm going to highlight the top of each of these days in the border. And then I can put the date and stuff. So I have little symbols that I use for the day. What I end up doing is using planetary symbols because each day is named after a planet. So I just use the planetary symbols. So like for Monday, I use the moon. For Tuesday, I use the Mars symbol. I use a kind of like an older version where the line goes through the circle because I like how it looks better. Wednesday, we have the Mercury symbol. Thursday, we have the Jupiter symbol. Friday, we have the Venus symbol. I don't put the crossbar. Those crossbars actually came about way later in sort of the history of alchemical symbols. They didn't originally have like the line through it. When you see, usually it's used as the female symbol now, but like the Venus symbol that has like the line through, that line is actually a cross. They did the same thing with Mercury. Didn't originally have a cross through it. I don't use it because I like how it looks better. It looks kind of like a little mushroom, which is fun. I think this is actually the Tokipona symbol for Soko that people use now for mushroom. And then Saturn for Saturday, and then the sun is usually like a circle with a dot in it, but there is an old version that's more like, it kind of looks like a meteor. And I like how that one looks, so I kind of do this like little 6 looking thing. Or that's actually how I write a D usually as well, but when I'm using the Roman alphabet. And then I'll put the dates, and I will explain now that I'm filling things in what I'm using, the writing system. What I'm doing is I'm using Tengwar, which is used for Elvish usually, but I'm using it for Old English, and I'm not using the mode that Tolkien used to write Old English. Tolkien did write some Old English with Tengwar. He never really like elaborated on how he did it, but we can kind of see how he did it. I don't like how it looks. It looks very busy. I'm using more of like the Sindarin mode where you just mostly use, or at least the old Sindarin mode, the classical one, where you mostly just use a letter for them, and the diacritics aren't vowels like they usually are with Quenya, and the standard English mode. I use them to show like different things about Old English sounds, and then I just write in Old English with I made my own mode basically for the Tengwar. But I am using the Tengwar numbers for the dates. And because the elves use base 12, the numbers are duodecimal. They're dozenal. So yeah, this is 16, but it's 1 and then it's 4 because it's 1 dozen 4. Then we have 1 dozen 5. Dozen 6, so that's 18. The dots are optional. They're just emphasizing that it's a number and not a letter. Wait, dozen 6. Oh, 7 goes the other way. Yeah, dozen 7. Dozen 8. Dozen 9. Dozen 10. Okay. Okay, so I have my dates, and then I have my work schedule, and I'll explain how I do that too. With my work schedule, oh, I don't have work that day. I already need to use white up. That's right, I don't have work on Monday. Ha ha ha. Okay. This book does not like cooperating with my my whiteout stick very much, I found. There we go. Okay, so what I have is, I'll go to Tuesday. There is like a period of time, like the window of time when I usually work, and there are 3 or 4 kinds of classes that I usually teach, because I'm a teacher. And so what I do is, to say which class it is, there's 2 squares, and I kind of mentally divide each one into 2 smaller squares each way, so it's kind of like, it might be hard to see because it's tiny, but it's like a 4x4 square. I'm not drawing this very neatly, but that's sort of the idea. And so each of these squares going down is a class period, like a time, and then each of these squares in each direction is a subject, and I just have it memorized what subject is in what place. Like it goes subject, 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 subject. And so I can say what my hours and what class I'm teaching just by going down like this. So I'll go like, okay, this is my first class, then I'm teaching this class, then I have another of this class, then I have another of this class. Actually, I have 3 of that in a row on Tuesday. And then I have this class over here, and then 2 of this class. And now I know, just from the slots, because I know my schedule typically, like my range, I know what I have when. And so as I go through that day, I'll like be like, okay, I finished that class. Okay, that class is done. Or like, ooh, this class is canceled. I'm going to cross that out. And then up here I have this dot that shows this is work. I have a little symbol that I use for that. And then when I've like logged my hours using our like hour logging thing, then I just cross it off, and then that's work for the day. So I just do that in my corner so I know when work is. So I'm just going to do that real quick. It doesn't take me that long usually to put my hours in. So I'm going to do that up here too. And I do have a system for like my highlighters. I use certain colors for things. So yeah, let's see. I'm going to go. So Tuesday, it starts later. So yeah, like I start an hour later, so I'm just going to skip one of those half lines. And that's Wednesday. And then Thursday, it's very similar to Tuesday actually. It goes and then Friday, I got nothing at the beginning, so then it goes down. It's like one of these. Oh, and then it's that one. That's interesting. Okay. I'm substituting this week for someone, so I have a little bit of a different schedule than I usually do. Okay, and Friday's usually a bit shorter. Okay. So I have my work schedule for the week now in my margins. So on Monday, I'm like, I don't have to go and like write my work schedule now because it's on my weekly, and I can just write other stuff, you know, like just journal, doodle, take notes if I'm reading a book or something. But before that, there's more weekly stuff I want to get through, and I do realize what time it is. The stream is supposed to be over, but I'm gonna finish this first. I have some weekly stuff that I do. So like Tuesday night, I have an event. Wednesday, none. Thursday night, I have a different kind of event. Right. Thursday night, different kind of event. And then Friday, I have 2 things. I have 2 events, and one of those is Yesterlore. So I'm just putting the highlighter dots first so that they can dry a little bit. These highlighters are very sensitive to my pens, So if I highlight over text, usually it just ends up being like smudged a little bit. Sometimes I'm okay with that, like if it's dried a lot, but since I just wrote all of this, I'm not going to be going over stuff. I'm going to go over with the highlighter already. So I'll put my Tuesday night event, and I have a little symbol I use for each of these events since they recur. And if you're curious, yes, I'm using Sitalampona for these. They're just like, these are just Tokipona words in Sitalampona that represent what they are to me. They're very vague. And then I have some habits as well that I like to work on. And I'm going to say what days I want to do those. The main one I've got going right now is just keeping up with piano practice has been a challenge for me. So I try to do that most days of the week. I give myself some days off, but most days I try to do some, at least even for like 5 minutes, just to practice what I've already learned, or just review stuff. I like to do piano, and I have a little piano symbol I draw for it, which is fun, just to doodle a little piano. It's just like 3 white keys and 2 black keys. Myself Friday off and do it on Saturday. Okay, and then I'm just gonna, in my own time, I'm gonna erase the pencil and add some of my gold gel pen and stuff over these. Oh, and there's one other thing on Wednesday I need to do. That's right. I'm gonna add that in. Cool. So that is how I do my bullet journal. So for the week, I have, you know, this space for my dailies, which is usually enough because Monday's not going to probably have a lot. Tuesday, Wednesday, I usually don't take up more than half a page. Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. And if I do go a little bit over, Saturday and Sunday usually are like, there's not much I write. So I could just bleed over Friday or something here and not have as much space on Saturday. That's usually fine. And that's why I'm okay with this sort of like loose, giving myself a vague amount of pages. And literally the worst case scenario is I run out of space and just start writing here for, you know, the end of the week. And that's fine. It's not the end of the world. Especially because at the end of the week, I already know what my schedule has been. So it's okay if I have to flip back or something. But that's usually what works for me. I have tried other things. I do other stuff sometimes. Sometimes I get into a rut and I change my format. Sometimes I put my schedule at the top and have like the Dutch door down here. Or sometimes I have a Dutch door up here and the schedule down here. Sometimes I just have a page where I have my schedule and I flip to it. But I usually do some kind of cutout border just because it's fun. It's nice to have the strips. I like the interlace. So I hope this was fun. I only really talked about one of my upcoming events. I was really worried about having stuff to talk about, and then I just ended up talking about one of them for a long time. So yeah, other than the Silmarillion adaptation thing that I was doing, I'm going to do some reading, like reading some stories in modern English for the most part. Not like Yesterlore reading old stuff like we usually do. I mean, it is old stuff, but I'm not going to be like pseudo-translating as we go. And there's a couple other things. I wanted to do some more conlang stuff because it's been a long time since I've done any conlang content. It's been, I checked, it's been 10 months. So I might do some more conlang content soon as well in my project streams. And there is some, and some stuff I want to read. And maybe some more translation projects too. I also am interested in I don't know, doing like little collaborative things. If people in chat want to work on stuff together, that would also be fun. But yeah, that is all for today. We went a little bit over my time, but we also had some technical difficulties. Still figuring out this whole thing. I'm really upset about not being able to be landscape in Twitch streaming on mobile. As you can see, when I try to go landscape, it rotates the page. It just rotates. So that's annoying. But now I know for next time that that's going to be the case. I hope this was fun to watch. how I do my journal, and hearing a little bit about me rambling about Tolkien stuff, because I could do that all day. I just can't do a lot of Tolkien content because, you know, copyright and stuff. I can't like read stuff to you, but talking about it is fine. Lots of people do that. I hope everyone has a good rest of your day or time zone or whatever it is, and thank you and farewell.